Okay.
Good morning. Monty, I can't seem to hear you. Can you try and say something and do a sound check?
No, I think everyone else can hear me.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Leah, are you hearing
Please
other
bear
people?
with us. We just need to figure out the audio. Hi there, Monty. Would you? Oh,
Yeah,
I
can you
can
hear me
hear you now.
It's like a bad cell phone commercial.
Yeah.
We think we have our technical issues resolved.
I think we're good to go. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so let's get started. First, I'm going to take roll, and we'll see who all's here and establish a quorum. So Thomas Howe, Thomas Allen,
here.
Shannon Reed,
Here.
Rebecca Buford,
Here.
Sarah Waters,
Here.
Christina Gentry, Erica Zimmerman,
Here.
Dana Ortiz,
Here.
Shannon Oury,
Here.
Ron Gacious, Edith Guppy,
Here.
Monty Soka here. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 members present, which creates a quorum. So we'll call the meeting to order, and I'm going to ask Leah to read the opening statement, and then we'll get started on the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Leah Roseland, Affordable Housing Administrator. I'm going to provide a few procedural reminders for the virtual meeting. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and public access cable channel 25. During the meeting, when you're not participating, please mute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon found in the lower left-hand side of the Zoom menu next to the video icon. When you're muted, a red line will appear over the icon. Muting your microphone during the meeting will make it easier for everyone to hear. You'll just have to remember to unmute if and when you want to speak. In some cases, I may mute or unmute people as needed to minimize distractions during the meeting. Please remember to state your name every time you speak for the benefit of those listening remotely. You can turn your video camera on or off by clicking the video icon in the menu. For the purposes of this public meeting, when you're participating in the meeting, please keep your video on. When you're not participating in the meeting, it's okay to turn your video off. You'll still be able to listen. You'll just have to remember to turn your video back on when you start to participate. Turning your video off when you're not participating will make sure that the active meeting participants can be seen on the screen. In some cases, I may turn someone's video off if they are not actively participating to avoid distractions during the meeting. You can always turn your video back on during the meeting. If you're participating by phone, you can click *6 to unmute your phone. For those using Zoom, somewhere on your screen, you'll see a choice to toggle between speaker and gallery view. Speaker view shows the active speaker. Gallery view tiles all the meeting participants. Board members and city staff members, you must state your name and title each time you speak. All motions will need to be stated clearly. After a motion is made and seconded, the chair will call on board members individually to provide their vote. Mr. Chair, you will then need to announce whether the motion carried and the count of the vote. When public comment is sought on an item, individuals participating via Zoom should use the raise your hand feature. Windows and Mac users can access this feature through the participants button at the bottom of their screen. Android and iPhone users can access this feature through the more button located at the bottom right-hand corner of their screen. For those calling in by phone, you may dial *9. Individuals will be called upon by name in the order they appear in the meeting host screen. When you're called on, please unmute your listening device and state your name before speaking. The chair chair will then call for in-person public comment for those without access to technology options. Staff present will direct you to the podium to speak following social distancing and safety protocols. The regular 3-minute time limit will apply. Thank you.
All right, this is Monty Sokup, Chair. Thank you, Leah. At this point, we will open for public comment. I'm going to read the public comment thing so everybody knows. The board will allow public comment on items listed on the agenda. Each person is limited to 3 minutes for public comment. Members of the public may provide public comment on multiple agenda items. General public comment on items or issues that are not scheduled on the agenda may be made after all regular business of the board has been conducted. Each person will be limited to 3 minutes for general public comment. That said, is there anyone that in the chamber there or online that would like to make a public comment? So just raise your hand and we'll try to get you up in a position to do so.
Mr. Chair, this is Leah Roseland, Affordable Housing Administrator. There's nobody present at City Hall for public comment, and I don't see anybody on screen raising their hand.
Okay, seeing none, we'll close public comment. The second agenda item is to approve the minutes from the February 14th meeting. So I would be receptive to a motion to approve or amend or comment on those minutes.
Sarah Waters, University of Kansas, motion to approve minutes.
Okay.
Rebecca Buford, second.
All right, so we have a motion to approve the minutes and a second on the floor. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, I will close discussion and take the roll. I'm gonna call you in the order we did originally. So if you'd be ready to remember who you come after, and we'll get through this quickly. So Thomas Allen.
Approve.
Shannon Reed.
Approve.
Rebecca Buford.
Approve.
Sarah Waters.
Approve.
Erica Zimmerman.
Approve.
Dana Ortiz.
Approve.
Shannon Oury.
Approve.
Edith Guffey.
Approve.
Monty Sokup, approved. Motion passes 9-0. Okay, we're on to the regular agenda items. We have a Corporation for Supported Housing presentation.
Hi, that's me and my colleague. Hi, Kim Keaton and my colleague, Katrina Van Valkenburg. We do have some slides. We sent them in advance. Last week, I've made one small change just on the agenda. I just put our names. If you don't mind, can I go ahead and share my screen?
This is Leah Roseland, Affordable Housing Administrator. You should be able to go ahead and share screen, but let me know if there's a problem.
Looks good. It was disabled, but now it's going.
Okay, great.
All right. Go into slideshow mode. Great. So this is Kim Keaton from Corporation for Supportive Housing. Thank you for inviting us here today. I see a lot of familiar names and faces from our work in Douglas County, which I'm going to talk to you about a little bit today. And so we have been lucky enough to have contracted with Douglas County starting in September of last year to do a supportive housing needs assessment. Today's presentation, I will at the end of it go through sort of what that project is, but we're going to start by setting some baselines around just, you know, the core tenets of supportive housing. Most people here probably know what that is, but it's always good to sort of level set and get everyone on the same page. Talk about what it can look like in a community. Talk about overview of some of the funding sources, and then some regional examples. But first, some introductions. So as I said, Kim Keaton, I'm the Director of Data and Analytics for CSH. CSH is a national nonprofit, but I'm one of 2 staff located in Kansas City, Missouri. And so I do work all over the country, but I've been privileged to be able to do work close to my home with this project. And I'll let my colleague Katrina introduce herself.
Good morning. I'm Katrina Van Valkenburg, and I'm the Managing Director for the Central Region at CSH. So I oversee all our work in the center of the country. So I get to keep up on what's happening in Kansas. Thank you for having us today.
So just quickly about CSH, as I said, we're a national nonprofit, about 145 staff and growing if you were to check out our jobs page right now. And a lot to do in the housing department and a lot of work to be done. Our mission is to improve the lives of vulnerable people, maximize public resources, and build strong, healthy communities. We believe that housing with support services can help build strong, healthy communities and that where people thrive in the community. So I'm going to turn over to Katrina. She's going to set the stage for supportive housing. And I can just advance the slides, Katrina.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much, Kim. Yeah, we'd love to chat with you a little bit about supportive housing, just make sure we're all kind of having the same understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about supportive housing. So when we talk about supportive housing, we're really talking about affordable housing that has services attached to it, and it's permanent housing is what we are focused on, is permanent affordable housing that have services that really assist the tenants in addressing whatever their needs are. And so this is really the core description of supportive housing.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are people seeing like a dark screen, or can you actually see
it's all gray, Kim.
This is
so weird. It's not showing the actual slide. What if you go to the next slide? Will it show you the next one?
Oh, you know what?
Here it goes. It's got
timings.
Yep.
Timings.
Yeah. Great. And when we think about supportive housing, one of the things that makes it different from affordable housing is it's really focused on people who face the most complex challenges. And so that often we're looking at who are folks who can't even get into affordable housing, and who are the folks that once they get into affordable sometimes end up getting evicted, and how do we use services to get people into housing and then help them stay there once they're there. So we're often talking about people who have experienced homelessness, people who have mental health challenges, substance use issues, things like that have created, have made it difficult for them to maintain housing in the past. And really with this idea of how do we create stability so that we want it to be permanent, autonomy, that people have control over their own lives, and that it's housing that has dignity. You can go to the next one, Kim. And so we do supportive housing in different ways. So it can be done as a single site, right? Like it can be a single building or a single property that can be either 100% supportive housing, or it can be affordable housing that has a little bit of supportive housing, or it could be market rate housing that has a little supportive housing. There are lots of different ways, but one way is doing it in one building. And then another way that we do it sometimes is in a scattered site model. And that's often a leased model rather than a development model, where there may be a landlord who says, yes, I would like to rent to your tenants. So I'm going to dedicate X number of units in my housing. Or you may just go out and rent unit by unit by unit. This is a pretty common model of supportive housing, especially with HUD funds that are more of a rental kind of model. And we can also develop supportive housing in a number of different ways. So one is we can do new construction or new development where we build a whole building. Or we can do rehab. There may be a building in the community that's perfect for using for supportive housing. It might be a historic building. It could be it's just a building that's available on the market. But that's another way, either new construction or rehab as ways that we approach supportive housing development. And then the third way is a master lease model, and that's where you're not building it. You're not doing the development part, but you're going to a landlord, and maybe with a landlord, somebody who owns a building says, I'll rent you 10 units in this property, and you rent all 10 of those units, whoever the sponsor is. So it could be a nonprofit, it could be government. Somebody rents those units, and then they lease those units to the tenants who live in them. So that's kind of the three different models we often see with supportive housing development, either building it new, rehabbing it, or master leasing if there's enough housing in the community. And the model you use depends so much about the community, right? Like if you have very little rental stock, master leasing just isn't a good way to go. But if you have a lot of available land, new development may be the way to go. Or if you have buildings that are underutilized or available, rehab may be the way to go. So it really depends on what works and is needed in particular communities. And the same with size of properties, right? Like your supportive housing project could be 6 units, it could be 10 units, it could be 100 units. It's really, what's the context for the community you're building it in? How is it like the other properties that you have in your community?
Katrina Esmonte, SoCo. On the master lease option, are you typically leasing at market rate, or are you trying to lease below market rate? How does that work? I mean, if I'm a property owner and I'm interested.
Yeah, it's a good question.
You know?
Yeah, I think most often you're leasing at market rate because you're most often master leasing using resources like HUD funding that will pay for operating that allows you to pay market rate. Now,
fair market rate,
Right.
not
yeah. And then the other part though is your tenants, because your tenants typically in supportive housing are at 30% and below area median income, they're very poor. They're considered extremely low income by housing finance agencies and by HUD, so that you need to have some kind of operating subsidy of some sort, whether it's a housing choice voucher or it's operating funds from HUD that allow you to both pay the rent on the unit that the landlord can use to keep the unit in good shape. At the same time, that's the rent's low enough for the tenant that they can pay their portion of the rent.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
It also helps to add a layer of guarantee to the unit if people, for example, have criminal background histories that would normally, or evictions in their past that would normally make a landlord nervous. This app provides an extra layer of sort of assurance that the rent's going to be paid to landlords.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that other extra level of assurance is the services that the tenant's receiving, so that the landlord also knows there's someone who's working with the tenant, you know, if problems arise. That becomes so important, you know, when we think about supportive housing and what supportive housing is able to do because of its structure, what makes it different from other housing. So like when we think about on this list of key components of supportive housing, number 5 is coordinates among key partners. And part of that is how in supportive housing, supportive services and property management work really closely together with the same goal of keeping the tenant housed, making sure rent's paid and the tenant stays housed. And in a master leasing model, that would be that coordination between the service partner and the landlord or the building owner of that property. But other kind of key components of supportive housing is, you know, it's really based on this idea of engaging households with multiple barriers. So we're really looking at those individuals who have not been able to make it in affordable housing and using services as the key with affordable housing to help create a successful housing opportunity for people. So they may be folks who have been in our shelters for a long time. They may be cycling from shelter to emergency room. They may be individuals with mental health or substance use issues. They could be families who are at risk of losing children to child welfare or have lost children to child welfare and need housing and stability to regain a custody of their children, or could be folks who are exiting jail or prison, especially individuals exiting jail and prison with mental health or substance use issues that were really part of what got them there in the first place. And how do we use housing with services to really get people into housing by reducing the barriers of entry, and then how we provide services to keep them housed once they're there. And then again, this affordability issue. We don't want tenants to pay more than 30% of their incomes for rent, but we also know that we need that our tenants don't have much income. You know, they're typically 30% and below area median income. And so we need some kind of subsidy, operating subsidy of some sort to help make up that difference. And then we want in supportive housing for it to be housing first. So we want it to be that a tenant has both the rights and the responsibilities of a leaseholder. And so the lease that we use in supportive housing should look like the lease that's used in any other type of housing. And when we think about the services that we're providing to tenants, we want them to be flexible and voluntary. And it's really this idea of how do we provide services to tenants that are the services they want and the services they need? And how are we as the staff in supportive housing responsive to the tenants around how we provide services and ensuring that what we provide is something that they want to use in their own lives. We are very focused on a housing first model, so we want to reduce all those barriers to get people into housing. We want to get people into housing as quickly as possible and then wrap these services around them. So once they're in housing, they can stay housed. But we don't want to put up a lot of extra barriers on the front end for them to get into the housing. And then we want to think about all the ways we connect with the community when we think about supportive housing. And that can be things from making sure tenants can get connected to like mental health supports in the community or faith communities, whether they want to belong to a church or a synagogue or a mosque. But what are the things that really add value to the lives of the tenants, and how do we help them connect to the community? So it's not only what's happening in our buildings, but also how our buildings are connected. And in the same way, we want to think about how we're a good neighbor as a property. So how are our staff connected to our neighbors, to community meetings? How are we participating in the life of the community? That also becomes part of what we think about when we think about the key components of supportive housing. So there are different ways that we fund supportive housing, but basically funding falls into these three buckets. One is capital or development funding, then operating funding and services funding. So if you're going to build it, whether you're doing new construction or you're doing a rehab project, you'll need capital funding or financing to really build the property. And the most common form of financing for affordable housing in the United States is low-income housing tax credits. Some people refer to it as LIHTC, but it's low-income housing tax credits. It funds more affordable housing than any other source in the United States. Low-income housing tax credits falls into two categories, 9% credits and 4% credits. Supportive housing most typically is funded with what are called 9% credits. 4%, you have to have a lot of soft financing to go with it, and so it's much harder to use. It's not impossible, though. We see some projects that get funded with 4% credits, but most typically when people are talking about low-income housing tax credits, they're talking about 9% credits. The other source that is very common in supportive housing is home dollars. This is federal money that flows through to participating jurisdictions. So your community may be a participating jurisdiction, your state is a participating jurisdiction, and home money flows through to participating jurisdictions and then can be used for supportive housing. The big opportunity right now across the country is that there's under the American Rescue Plan Act, there's home dollars that are dedicated to people at risk, who are homeless and at risk of homelessness. So there's a lot more home money currently that can be used for developing supportive housing. So it's a great opportunity right now to use that to create units. And then there's the National Housing Trust Fund. And I don't know if you have a state housing trust fund or a local housing trust fund, but sometimes there are also the state or local ones or other public sources you can use for capital financing. But these are the most typical sources. You know, occasionally you'll see like some CDBG money or something like that in a supportive housing project. It's not as common, but things like we see that occasionally. Then when it comes to operating, this is that piece that funds the difference between what the tenant can pay and what the landlord or the property owner needs to keep the building operating well. Because if the rents are too low, there isn't enough income for the landlord or the building owner to do the rehab on the units as needed to keep them in good shape over time. So they need to have a fair market rent to be able to keep their building up, and tenants need a low rent level because if they're 30% of area median income, that means they're extremely low income, and then we don't want them to have to pay more than 30% of their income in rent. So we need something that covers the difference between what the fair market rent is for a unit and what the tenant can pay. The most common places we find this is in through continuums of care. So continuums of care have the HUD funding that comes through dedicated to addressing homelessness in communities. And so that's a really common place to find operating funds for supportive housing. The other one that we see, and this is much more typical, especially with projects that are funded with low-income housing tax credits, is funding through housing authorities, especially housing choice vouchers, because they can be project-based. And housing finance agencies who have the low-income housing tax credits really need to have a guarantee of funding over time for operating, and project-basing housing choice vouchers is key to being able to secure low-income housing tax credits. And then there are sometimes state programs, though there aren't any currently in Kansas, that you can use for operating funds. On the service funding side, there are a few options that we see most typically. One is, again, the continuum of care and getting services through service funding through the continuum of care. Again, it's HUD dollars that flow through to the continuum of care. It could be community mental health centers or CMHCs, that the community mental health centers have funding and they're able to support tenants in supportive housing with that funding. And then there are other federal sources like SAMHSA that can sometimes support services in supportive housing. And then in some states, though not in Kansas, we see state Medicaid plan waivers that pay for housing tenancy supports. And that can be a great resource as well. And then philanthropy usually is filling gaps between some of the funding, sometimes in all three of these different supportive housing funding types. So there are a couple of projects that are close to home. One is Eileen's Place in Wyandotte County, which is 100% supportive housing for families. This one used Kansas's low-income housing tax credits, the 9% credits, and
actually,
national.
that's a typo. It should be 4%.
Oh, they use 4%.
They did use 4%. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Oh, cool. With National Housing Trust Fund dollars. And then you can see the other project is a project, All Haven in Kansas City, Missouri, which has 50 units. And of those, this is what we call integrated supportive housing project, where it's a mix of supportive housing and affordable. So in this project, 12 units are supportive housing and 48 units are affordable. And this one used low-income housing tax credits, the 9% out of Missouri.
And just to add, one of the things that, you know, in our conversations with the people we've been working with in Douglas County and Lawrence is, you know, a couple of challenges seen in the community. One around low vacancy rates due to being a college town, and another around some zoning issues. And, you know, CSH, we're not exactly like the zoning issue, you know, housing code, affordable housing code, like experts, but just so you can sort of place these two projects within the context of the places that they're in. They are definitely located in areas of Kansas City, Kansas and Kansas City, Missouri that have single family homes, that have apartments, that are, you know, have all the types of housing that we see in cities. You know, in the case of All Haven, it's, you know, it's right on 31st Street in Midtown area, 31st near Truce. So it's in a transportation corridor near where the bus lines operate, not far from where the streetcar is going to be extended down, you know, through. So it's a really, you know, they're located in areas of the city that both have, you know, services, but also are near to where lots of other people live. So just wanted to sort of point that out.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions before we move on to the local needs that we've been working on? All right, then I'll dive right in.
I think Rebecca has a question.
Okay, so I can't see everybody because I'm sharing my screen.
Sorry, I should have jumped in. Rebecca Buford with Tenants to Homeowners. How many units are at Eileen's place? And can you speak to, it doesn't seem very common that 100% is supportive service housing, or what are the factors you need to think about when you do 100%?
I'd say,
yeah, it's good.
Sorry.
I think it's 100 units, and they're kind of duplex. You know, like you could see in the picture, like, you know, each of these buildings has duplexes that are sort of right next, you know, to each other. And so they feel like little houses. Like there's like 2 bedrooms upstairs and a bedroom downstairs, you know, sort of kitchen, living room type of thing. You know, the reality is for, I'll say something and then I'm sure Katrina will build on it, but, you know, 100%, it's not as common as it used to be, I guess. I think one of the things you have to really make sure you have that's really strong in a 100% building, like as big as this, is really strong property management partner that is, you know, really managing the units and the quality of the units and like sort of all the things that a large property has, and that's really distinct from the support services. I think in Eileen's place, they're done by Metro Lutheran Ministries, which is on either side of the state line over here. The other thing I'll say is, quite frankly, from like a budgeting standpoint, these mixed affordable or mixed market rate with some supportive is easier to sort of pencil out, right? You know, you need a lot of services for 100 families. So I don't know what you want to add.
Yeah, I think when supportive housing started, you know, in the beginning of the 90s, really, we were seeing 100% supportive housing projects. And then I think in the 2000s we started seeing more integrated supportive housing. My guess is we're about 50% of new units are integrated, 50% are 100% supportive housing. But it really depends on the community, what kind of resources you have. You know, if your goal is to create more supportive housing quickly, it's easier to do it with 100% units. If you're looking for more community integration, you know, integrated supportive housing may be the approach you want. You know, I think most communities have a combination of them. So that, you know, there may be people who, let's say you're using coordinated entry from your continuum of care to fill units. It may be there are some people who feel like they would prefer to be in a unit that's in 100% supportive housing building. And there may be others who are like, I'd really prefer to be in an integrated supportive housing project.
I have a question. Were both of these rehabs, or was one built specifically as supportive housing and the other one was rehab? How did you do that?
I think they're both new construction, right, Kim?
Yeah, these ones are both brand new. In Kansas City area, we have a lot of new construction rather than rehab because we have a lot of land kind of here. And so like I know that there's one coming up on Jackson and 39th Street. That's like one of those big tracts of blocks that probably had houses in the past that all got, you know, demoed into the basement, and that's going to be all new construction as well. We just have a lot of that here, so that's what we see here mostly. Yeah,
and I think often it's what's the opportunity. You know, do you have property to rehab that would work well, and you could do it at around the same price per square foot you could with new construction? You know, it really depends on what your housing stock's like for that, and whether it's an opportunity or not to do rehab versus new construction.
The organization that developed and runs All Haven, Save Inc., they have quite a large number of, for Kansas City, a large number of properties. Mm-hmm. And some of them are just like duplexes, like were already existing apartments that the organization owns. And I think they finally sold off their last duplex, but they're regular apartment buildings. They weren't built for supportive housing, but at some point in the organization's history, they acquire the building and use it for supportive housing. So
I think All Haven might be their first new construction.
It is. Yeah. In a long time. I think they're in maybe 25 years. So yeah. Great questions. Really appreciate them. I believe Eileen's Place falls into this. I know CSH did a supportive housing institute last year that reached across both sides of the state line in the metro area up here. And on the Wyandotte side, the organizations were going for properties that were in the land bank. So, you know, that's the county, the unified government owns quite a bit of land that then they will go into agreements with for, you know, if the development includes, you know, these kinds of things like services and affordable supportive housing.
I hate to be tacky, but you know, I grew up in that area in Kansas City, Missouri. So what's the plan to keep it from becoming run down, kind of like the area where no one wants to live eventually?
You know, Edith, that's a really good question. I live in Hyde Park, and you know, and I think that we see a lot of, you know, All Haven has not been without community pushback, and you know, Save and Inc. developed it alongside Vicino Group with the partnership of Vicino Group, and And they got a lot of community pushback because people live in neighborhoods that they feel like they've, and rightly so, have reclaimed, that formerly people didn't want to live there, but now they do. And they're worried about, you know, these, I use quotes around these people coming to live in our community. And there's a lot of education that goes into, you know, understanding that we all have a right to live everywhere in the community and that certain areas aren't designated for one kind of person or the other. The other thing I would say about these properties is, as you can see, they're really nice. They're landscaped, et cetera. And the agreements for the LIHTC units are like 30 years. I mean, there's 15 years and then and it goes out to 30. So it's a long time before it has the potential to be turned into sort of market rate housing. And so that's, I guess, if there's any plan, like that's it. And you know, there is an attempt to make sure that they're not all located in one area, right? That we're scattering this type of housing throughout the city, you know, from an equity standpoint. Although I will say quite a few happen to be located in the sort of 27th and down to 31st and Troost corridor. There's a lot of land there and a lot of service providers that are actually building just more housing, like on their kind of near where they already have their services. So
Kim, this is Shannon. So the real problem I see is that all of the funding mechanisms that are available, we are already using for another type of affordable housing. So we use our home fund allocation for TBRA for homeless and our local Chodo first time home buyer. All of our vouchers, you know, we are at 99% utilized. So I don't have a huge margin of vouchers to, I mean, really, we don't, our vacancy is our turnover. And so there aren't vouchers to put into units. And so when I see these issues, I just look at it and go, the only way to really fund some of this is to, you know, rob Peter, the low income, you know, tenant, to pay Paul, the homeless tenant, and who needs supportive housing. And I just always constantly feel like we're being torn between all needy partners and community members.
Yeah,
I think sorry, go ahead.
Well, I would say it would certainly help if there was more to go around. I get that for sure. Go ahead, Katrina.
I was just going to say the the American Rescue Plan Act home dollars are new resources that are really have to be dedicated to people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. So there is some new funding, and those capital dollars could be used on the front end for sure.
Well, and that's, you know, I mean, this is a good segue into the next part of the presentation, because that's certainly what Douglas County is trying to do. I think, you know, to recognize Shannon's concern is, you know, okay, if we build this housing, the housing authority feels pretty strapped as far as how to pay for some of the units. You know, certainly wouldn't be all on the housing authority. Some will come through the HUD continuum of care, the balanced state continuum of care, and other opportunities. So I'm going to move on in the interest of time, and then just so we can leave some discussion on the back end, if that's okay. All right. So CSH was approached last summer by Bob Troyansky and Jill Jolliker at the county for precisely the reason I was just saying. They felt they had a unique opportunity to put capital dollars into supportive housing, specifically because of what you just said, Shannon, with a lot of the priorities being around first-time home buyers and affordable. You know, the home ARP funding is specifically for at-risk and homeless households, and this felt like a unique opportunity. And so in working with them, we established some goals for assessing the need for supportive housing in Douglas County across a variety of sectors. So, you know, everyone who hears about or works with the homeless continuum of care, you hear about chronically homeless and by name list. I think we all recognize that there are multiple systems that feed into the homeless system, or that if folks were exited from, they would be really at risk of homelessness and long-term homelessness. So, so with that in mind, we identify data from multiple systems to inform the needs assessment and financial modeling. We've been working with community stakeholders to refine model assumptions and identify critical sectors, and conduct financial modeling to determine basically how much all this is going to cost. And so the goal is to create recommendations on the total need by unit type, which is also household type, singles versus families, and intervention, system efficiency improvements to reduce inflow. That is something that the kinds of things that there's another TA provider also doing a homeless system gaps analysis at the Center for Public Partnerships and Research. I always forget what the CPPR acronym stands for at KU, did a needs assessment of the homeless system at the same time as we did this. So they're really coming up with a lot of that part of it, and different development models to meet the needs. So that goes back to single site, you know, affordable, mixed, you know, scatter site, et cetera. And, you know, we've been seeking strategic direction and feedback from stakeholders through this community facilitation process. We've been attending the housing and homeless stakeholder meeting every couple of weeks and updating on progress. So 3 primary types of data have been taken into account. First, data about how many people are accounted for. Sorry, I have to reduce my window here. In assessed systems, data about what share of people have needs consistent with supportive housing. That goes back to what Katrina talked about earlier. Who is supportive housing for? People with quite often co-occurring conditions such as mental health, substance use, physical health, and are in, you know, potentially other types of issues as well, who would need intervention of supportive housing. And then data about local costs related to bringing supportive housing units online, operating them, and providing services. When we do this methodology, I should say, is based on national needs assessment that CSH has done. If you're interested in looking at our state-by-state national one, it's on our website at csh.org/data. You can actually download the numbers for the state of the estimates for the state of Kansas if you'd like, or you can take a look at those. But when we do the work, you know, when we do work in local communities like Douglas County, we're taking local data and adapting them, the methodology that we use nationally to local data. So we may include all sorts of sources from around the county and all the different types of systems. When we were kind of identifying the populations of interest, we definitely heard that families involved in child welfare who were experiencing homelessness were a key concern, as well as people with behavioral health challenges, folks exiting prison and the Douglas County Jail, that there are a number of folks that are in nursing homes that could be, you know, the nursing homes, there's basically no nursing home capacity. Many people in nursing homes might actually be more successful in the community. And then juvenile justice, which was a really tiny number. And then also develop the IDD population, that there's not a lot of capacity in the community there. Just a reminder, you know, CSH takes a multi-sector approach because we know that individuals and families who are in housing crisis touch a variety of systems besides the housing homeless system. Focusing only on one system can hide the needs for supportive services that are present in other systems that are not equipped to solve housing crises. So a good example of that is a correctional facility or child welfare foster care agency. The critical issue may be that the person is homeless that caused them to be involved in either of those systems, but those systems aren't set up to actually solve for that issue. And so a multi-sector approach lets us think about needs for supportive housing across systems and lets us use housing as a stabilization platform for people with diverse needs. When we do this work, we attempt to reduce the, counting people who might be bouncing around by narrowing the data that we request to a small point of time. In this case, we focused on July to September of 2021 when we were talking to local stakeholders such as Bert Nash, Family Promise, DECA, et cetera.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
Ron, you're on mute, buddy.
I heard the excuse me and then it went silent.
Ron, you're on
Ron,
mute.
you're on mute.
Ron Gacious, AHAB board member, chamber representative. You spoke about the many sectors that you're touching and described how the individuals and the families you're supporting are coming from many different parts of society. And you're talking about all of the other different service platforms that you come in contact with. I still don't understand what role, what's a day in the life of the supportive services person look like? I still don't understand what you do. I see who you're talking to. I see the data you're collecting, but what are you doing with these families? Are you at the table helping them with a monthly budget? Are you taking them to appointments? Are you making sure they show up for a parole officer meeting? Are you making sure, are you badgering them into whatever the society response? That's a horrible word. I take it back. But what are you doing?
Are you asking what CSH is doing?
Yes. What is the supportive services component doing as it touches all of these different service systems on behalf of the individual or the family?
I think you have a
role. Is it a connector role? Are you service providers yourself?
No. Let me try and clarify our CSH's role. We did a supportive housing needs assessment. We're not in the community working with clients. We're working with people.
I'm not talking your agency. My question is not about your agency. I'm talking about the supportive services model that you've described.
So Ron,
we had dollars come from our housing trust fund to support supportive services. What are they paying for?
Sure. So the services in supportive housing depends a little bit on who the tenant is, but it almost always is done through, I'm going to call it a case management model, but where a family or an individual has a staff person who provides the services. And there are different models for that, but basically it's many of those things you said, right? It may be somebody needs help with budgeting. It may be that they talk to them when they're having a hard time. It may be they're connecting them to mental health services in the community. It may be they're offering groups or other things like that. But the services are really whatever the tenant needs to be successful. So most often it's kind of sort of support, like a mental health kind of support, though not technically counseling, and also helping tenants problem solve when they run into problems. So, one of the common things that happens in supportive housing is that a tenant may fall behind in rent. So one of the things the service person will do is help them problem solve. How can they correct this issue? How can they figure it out? So a lot of that is the staff kind of walking with the tenant to help them become more successful. It could be connecting them with mental health services or substance use services in the community. It could be running a group in the supportive housing. It could be helping with budgeting. It's really very global and really based on what the individual needs.
The other thing I would point out too is the population that often benefit from supportive housing. You know, they're different than those that fundamentally would benefit from affordable housing, could go to their job or jobs in the community, make their rent, and live life successfully. You know, when you talk about some, for example, a young person who's grown up mostly in foster care, potentially was incarcerated for a period of time, experienced homelessness, when they move into a unit for the first time, it may be the first time they've ever used a stove. It may be the first time they've ever even gone grocery shopping because they've experienced such institutionalization. And so some of the services, particularly right after move-in, are really focused on helping that person become stable in housing, helping that person understand the responsibilities of a tenant, how to be a good neighbor, how to pay your rent on time, how to budget, as Katrina said, how to shop, how to safely live in a unit, use the stove, adjust the heat, use the water, you know, all that kind of thing. And so, you know, it's really built upon what the person actually needs and what's identified as their need by the service provider. I hope that helps.
Very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, this is Leah Roseland, Affordable Housing Administrator. I have a comment and a question to Mr. Geisha's question. Burton Ash is a local organization that is looking to develop a new supportive, permanent, affordable housing project. And I was going to say that we could invite Matthew Falk from Burton Ash to speak more specifically about the supportive services they offer, if that would be of interest to any AHAB members, to get more specificity on what local services are provided. And then there was a question that came through the chat. The question is, may we know how their model is permanent supportive housing while renting from landlords? So is the housing permanent to the person being housed? So I think the question is, if it's a private landlord, how can we guarantee that it's permanent?
Well, I think if in that situation, if a landlord wanted to not renew a lease, then the sponsor who was master leasing, they would look for a new unit that the tenant could move into, so that they remained housed even if their landlord changed.
Yeah, when we say permanent in that regard, much like, you know, Shannon Ori at the Housing Authority, like the vouchers that are attached to people, it's the source of funding that's permanent, right? And so that's what you're able to use, you know, ideally to move someone if it comes to that. It's a good question. Great. Any more questions before we move on? So one of the things I like best about working in a place like Douglas County is that, you know, when we look at the needs across all these systems, the number we have reached is 381 units of permanent supportive housing are needed. That feels like a really solvable problem. You know, contrast that to the 2 million that are needed, you know, or 1.5 million that are needed nationally. It feels that Douglas County and Lawrence could potentially really move the needle if some, you know, key things fall into place and some key barriers. And I know there are barriers locally around new developments, and also around finding units for a scattered site, if we're able to work through some of those. And so this is the permanent supportive housing need that we calculated across these different systems. That includes people experiencing chronic homelessness, families involved in the child welfare system, transition aged youth, that's like that 18 to 25 age range, the justice system. So that's people exiting the jail as well as exiting prisons into Douglas County. Some great data available from the Reentry Task Force on that. Intellectual and developmental disabilities, behavioral health, and aging. So the next steps we're taking is calculating the cost per unit and over time. So with some input from local stakeholders, including Rebecca over at Tenants to Homeowners, we'll be calculating what that unit production looks like over 5 years. 5 years is the time period that the county wants us to look over. Sometimes when we do these things, we look over 10 years, but given the urgency of the resources available, we're shortening that unit production timeline. Assuming that the current state with Hallmark dollars is a unique opportunity to obtain usually rare capital funding for this population, and brainstorming on next steps on obtaining sustainable operating and services funding, recognizing the challenges in those two areas. These are the per unit costs that we'll be basing all of our calculations off of. And so for a 1-bedroom unit, capital cost per unit being $175,000. If that seems like a lot to you, in places like Chicago and Portland, Oregon, and New York City, it's well over $500,000 per unit. So, so just so you know, it seems like a lot to me, and then I remember that those other places have the most insane housing costs. So, so that's that. The operating cost per unit per year is based on fair market rent, and that HUD publishes, and that's what is usually vouchers that are they're allocated by the Housing Authority or paid for through the HUD continuum of care are pegged to. We're finalizing the report on this actually this week. Been working on it actively and creating recommendations to present to county commissioners in our working meeting on 3/23. That's next Wednesday. We've received the capital project list that the county is working on, and we'll be incorporating those current projects into what's already being planned for development locally to go towards that 381 unit figure. And then we'll also be including some ideas around national, what CSH views as national best practices or leading edge practices for closing operating and service funding gaps. Some ideas there, flexible funds that are used to pay for these operating and service funding gaps. They're usually a blend of philanthropy plus public funding that use pay for performance style contracting. Project-based vouchers and other partnerships with the Housing Authority, partnerships potentially with mental health centers and FQHCs, and then potential for other local and state funding. And that was it. So, just in terms of where we are, like I said, we're giving a draft of the report and recommendations and discussing it next week. And then after that, we'll be finalizing based on input and feedback and from the county and the commissioners, and moving it out into the community.
So Kim, this is Shannon Allery with the Housing Authority. On the pie chart where you break out the different groups, in your final report, will you attach numbers to those?
Oh yeah, yeah. This is just for the
or number of people, please.
Yes, we will have it in a table actually. So
great. Thank you.
And it'll be broken out by size of unit as well. So, and family type or household type rather. So yes.
Kim, this is Rebecca Buford with Tenants to Homeowners. Can you speak to when you say aging? Can you define that as far as supportive service housing, or is that just truly aging in place at that point? Or is there a little bit different definition there?
That's a really good question. That population, I will speak on it and I will let Katrina expand on it. This is not a population that is my personal area of expertise, but it can be both. You know, one thing that we see is that there are people who had affordability challenges in the community who are in nursing homes, but might not need to be. So with subsidized housing plus some support services, they could successfully age in the community. And then in terms of supportive housing, you know, that is adapted for seniors, there's some special considerations as far as, you know, how accessible units are and things like that.
Yeah.
Katrina, do you want to add to that?
Sure. And, you know, I think the other piece with aging is that the crossover between homelessness and aging, you know, we see a lot of people as they age fall into homelessness. And at the same time, among the population of individuals who have been homeless a long time, they die very young, you know, overall. So that when we think about aging and homeless population, we think of it starting at 55 because people die at least a decade younger than the general population if they've been living in shelters and on the street for a long time. So we do a lot of thinking at CSH about aging and how it's impacting homelessness and how to use housing as healthcare in general, but also for folks who are aging, how to keep people alive longer because they're so at risk.
Well, and one, this is Shannon Oury again, Housing Authority. One issue that I don't see talked about but because we house so many of the senior population is dementia and some issues that start coming along that actually require us to provide supportive housing to allow people to age in place. And the fact that there's nowhere for them to go. I mean, we say we're independent living, but really many of our units are independent living with a lot of help from live-in aides or people who are there to allow the people to stay in the units.
Yeah.
And I don't see that number. Like I can generate that number, but what I don't know is what's out there in that population.
Mm-hmm.
Kim and Katrina, thank you so much for this. Is Shannon Reed, Douglas County Commission representative. I'm excited to have a preview of this before our work session next week.
Oh, good.
So lots of things for me to think through more before then. I'm just curious about this pie chart. I'm surprised at how large the intellectual and developmental disabilities population is represented. That wasn't something I was expecting. So I'm just curious if you can speak a little bit to maybe definitions or examples of the type of supportive housing for those folks. So I'm thinking of like CLO once had a big presence and lots of homes where there was staff living in, well, there were different degrees, staff living in the homes with folks in co-living situations, or staff that would come regularly or maybe live next door in a duplex situation.
Mm-hmm.
So are there other particular examples? I don't know. I'm just surprised to see how large that is and wondering if there's anything glaring that jumps out.
I could speak to the conversation that we had. And I think Katrina can talk a little bit more about the model for that population. But I will say, you know, I was surprised by how large that slice of the pie is as well. You know, in speaking to I will say I want to give major props to Douglas County for wanting to even include this population. Not every local place that we do these needs assessments in has that population on their radar, right? And so, so that's great. I will say that in speaking to, I forget the name of the agency, I have to apologize for my porous brain, but we talked to a lot of agencies, and but they, you know, they acknowledge that they do have some units already that are basically like supportive housing, but the funding levels from the state are so low that they like can't actually serve that many people, and they have an issues with retaining staff, so they have to turn some of them back. So that's part of the reason why I think the population is larger than you would see, is they're not currently able to use the resources that they have. And then Katrina, can you talk a little bit more about the model and how it might be different?
Yeah, I think the model's very similar. I'd say one of the differences is we probably see the use of home health aides or attendants in supportive housing that's been developed for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because so many people also may have a physical disability that requires much more around kind of assistance from attendants. So that's not uncommon in those units. I think the other thing we really see in this population for folks with supportive housing is the tremendous need for supportive housing for individuals who have been kept at home by aging parents, and the parents are getting close to dying and being really uncertain about what the future of their child is. There's a tremendous need for supportive housing connected for those families, where they know that there's support and there's housing that their child can live in after they die.
Yeah, this is Shannon Reed again. Thanks for that. That helps me a lot. And I was thinking about that exact scenario you just described, and how maybe sometimes there are people who live in more rural communities and are having difficulty providing services for their adult children that have stayed at home with them and have some more complicated health issues. And so I was also thinking about models of, there are companies that facilitate or organizations that facilitate people having those individuals come live with them and their families in their home. And so I was just thinking through, like, if those are part of the numbers we are kind of aware of from places like Cottonwood or Mosaic or some of those other places that help facilitate those services. So anyway, thanks for fleshing that out for me a little bit. It's a surprising number.
Great. Any other questions?
This is Monty Sokup, Chair. Thank you, Katrina, and Kim. I was trying to mix those two together there.
Kim Tina. we can be Kim Tina. We're fine.
Yeah. Get tongue tied. So thank you for that. Really good information, and take that into account as we, do our work. So
thank you. We really appreciated being here and all the really thoughtful questions that we got. Really excited for, to get the report out there, and to, hopefully continue working with Douglas County on as you move through the planning.
Thank you. All right, with that, we're gonna close that subject, and we're gonna move on to the second item on our agenda, which is the Home 2022 allocation discussion. And Leah, I think do you have an introduction for this, or Danny, or maybe it's Brad, I don't know. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Brad Carr. I'm the Community Development Analyst, and I'll be handling this item today. The item before you is your recommendations for the 2022 home allocations. And just as a reminder, you're the recommending board to the City Commission, who will make the final decision, but they will take your recommendations into account. Part of the agenda packet, there are links to the applications that were received, and also some other documents to help you in your recommendations. And those are a scoring matrix, which was approved by the City Commission. a historical funding, so you can see how home funds have been spent in our community in the past. And then there's also a fact sheet just about the home grant in general for those of you that are not specifically familiar with the ins and outs of that program. I'm going to go over real quick just some of those for you and the public. The City of Lawrence does receive a Home Investment Partnership Program grant annually. So this is our annual grant. I know there was some discussion earlier about the home ARP funds that the city has received. We're not discussing those at this point. Those will be a totally separate discussion. These are just for our annual grant that we do receive from HUD. It's provided as a formula grant to eligible state and local governments to strengthen the public-private partnership and to expand the supply of decent, safe, and sanitary affordable housing. It is the largest federal block grant to state and local governments designed exclusively to create affordable housing for low-income households in our community. There are specific requirements for eligible activities. And so home funds can be used by the PJ, the participating jurisdiction, and that's the city, to provide incentives to develop and support affordable housing. It can be either rental housing or home ownership. And that can be provided through acquisition, including down payment and closing cost assistance to home buyers, new construction, reconstruction, or rehabilitation. It also can be used to provide tenant-based rental assistance. Another one of these acronyms that we use, that's TBRA. And that is a voucher program for getting individuals housed and keeping them housed in a 2-year program. There's also eligible activities is to provide reasonable administration costs for us to run the program, to provide operating expenses to our local community housing development organizations. Another acronym that we use, and that's CHODO, Community Housing Development Organization. We currently do have one of those in Lawrence, and that is Tenants to Homeowners. And so an eligible activity is to provide operating expenses for that organization. And in addition, we are required to reserve at least 15% of the grant goes to that community housing development organization for housing to be owned, developed, or sponsored for low-income affordable housing. There are, when we're doing any type of capital type rehabilitation, new construction, or acquisition, there are periods of affordability that are required to be enforced. And so if we are doing rental housing, new construction of rental housing, then that's 20 years. We're required to keep that as that affordable housing unit. And so we do have to place a deed restriction on the property in order to enforce that. And then in home ownership, it depends on the amount of funding that is used for the unit. So if we're just providing down payment and closing costs under $15,000, then it's just a 5-year period of affordability that the city is required to monitor that unit remains affordable, that only low-income individuals live in the house. For more expensive, over $15,000 per unit, that would be more of your acquisition or construction type projects. Then it can go out to a maximum of 15 years that the city is required to monitor that property. We do have our CHODO runs the local land trust. And so once our city required period of affordability takes over, they keep it in that permanent MORE model. The home requirements at the federal level only require us to monitor it, the city to monitor it for those 15, or 20 years, depending on the type of project. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with one of those documents that is linked to on the agenda. And this is a spreadsheet that we've created to help you with your decision and funding recommendations. And so as you can see this year, we did receive full applications for 4 different programs from 2 agencies. The Lawrence Douglas County Housing Authority submitted an application for that transitional tenant-based rental assistance, TBRA, in the amount of $300,000 was their request. Tenants to homeowners submitted for 3 different programs. There's that required CHODO set aside, which is that 15%, that minimum of 15% that we are required to allocate to them. You are allowed to recommend more of that, more than that 15% if you so choose. That CHODO operating funds is another project that they applied for funds for. And that one has a maximum that you can award, and that's 5% of the total grant. You cannot award more than that 5%. That would be the top that you would be allowed to. And then they also submitted for the first-time homebuyer program in the amount of $100,000. We are estimating that we have not received the official allocation from HUD as to the exact dollar amount that we will receive for the 2022 grant. And so we are basing all of these numbers that we will are on an estimated amount of $405,000 is what will be available for your recommendation. As you can see, we received applications requesting in the amount of $490,000. So we've created this spreadsheet here to help as you're going through your discussion. If you have some suggestions, we can fill in numbers in these and you can instantly see how much is left and able to allocate. We do have, before the actual discussion on the recommendations take place, we will have several of the board members will have to recuse themselves. And so they will be required to shut their video off. They can remain and listen. They do have representatives here from their agencies to speak towards their application if you do have questions. So we'll go ahead and get started. Open it up to if you just have any general questions about the procedure, and we'll go ahead and ask those board members to recuse themselves.
This is Rebecca Buford with Tenants to Homeowners. And if you guys don't have any other questions, I will recuse myself. And Nicholas Ward is on the call if you have any questions about our request. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.
And similarly, this is Shannon Oury with the Housing Authority. I will recuse myself. I believe Galal Obeid is on the line for us.
Thank you, Shannon. All right, I think that puts us in a position where we can talk about this Monty Sokup chair, where we can talk about the recommendations here. I assume everybody had a chance to look over this. Any thoughts or comments by anyone? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to, go ahead, Ron.
Mr. Chairman requested that we don't have funds for if we do the CHODO set aside at the required 15% and the CHODO operating funds at the 5% minimum. So I'm going to recommend, so we've got $85,000 we need to cut out of the request. Transitional housing request is 300. We had them at 250 last year. The first time home buyers program last year was 61,000. I'm sorry, 84,000 last year. It strikes me that the transitional housing, the TBRA program, is one in most need of stability of its funding. So I would make a recommendation that we continue the funding level for another year at 250,000. And then that would put the balance of the burden for balancing up this budget on the first time home buyer program, which would bring it all the way down to $35,000.
No,
a $35,000 cut down to $65,000, which is a cut from where they were last year of about $19,000. about $20,000. And that'd be my recommendation.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna open that up for discussion. Dana?
Yeah, thank you. Especially critical after we just heard from Corporation of Housing, Supportive Housing. The transitional voucher, the TBRA, and its various iterations in our community is one of the most effective outcome-based voucher programs that the clients and guests of Family Promise utilize, as well as other chronically homeless. It allows a lower level of acceptability rather than the long wait list of a Section 8 voucher, and it requires some of that supportive housing services for the period of 2 years. So only certain referring agencies can refer to these vouchers, and then they're required by an MOU to support those vouchers for a period. Now, anyone who successfully completes that voucher program after 2 years can roll over to a Section 8 voucher. So it has a plan attached to it. It has requirements for support attached to it. And I just wanted to speak that very clearly out because I know the whole voucher thing gets very complicated and confusing. Thank you. Dana Ortiz, Family Promise of Lawrence.
Yep. That's Monty Sokup, Chair. Thank you, Dana. As I recall, this number sticks in my head, but that had like a 85% success rate or something of keeping people housed, as I recall from the report, maybe a couple of years ago even. But
yeah, I know it's high. It's high. I don't know what it is currently.
I mean, that's from my memory. So, but it was really high. I was impressed with how high it was. So,
Edith Guffey, member at large, and I really detest having to pit these two organizations against each other because they both do really excellent work. So let me say that to begin with. So it seems like robbing Peter to pay Paul. And so that's where I begin. But I really don't support that big of a cut to the request for the first time home buyer program. That's a pretty big jump. And to just for the purposes of keeping the TBRA program level. Everybody's in need. Everybody's in need. And so that big of a cut, I would go to, 85,000 so that they both take somewhat of a hit and not just one program takes the hit.
This is Shannon Reed, Douglas County Commissioner. I would agree with Edith's sentiments. I don't like knocking down the first-time home buyer program that much. Almost 85, basically 85 is what we approved last year. So, I mean, to me, it seems like where there's room to bring it down is the CHDO operating funds, which are capped at 5%. I don't know, I mean, because tenants to homeowners application was all of those things together and they all kind of function together, right? And the way they report on them, those weren't three distinct applications necessarily. However, they do fund different things. So I guess I'm just wondering what other board members' thoughts are about bringing significantly, I don't really have a specific number, but bringing that operating funds number down, which is the one that can move, as I understand it.
Monty Sokup, Chair. Shannon, last year, for reference, the CHOTA operating fund allocation was $20,000. We did that last year and brought that down to 20. And that would make, you could make the first time home buyer program 67.5 at that point. I don't know I'm not sure what that does.
Yeah.
It's all going to tenants to homeowners. I guess I might be more in favor of like, 240 for TBRA and add that $10,000 to the first time home buyer. as a balancing of some kind that cuts $10,000 out of each, basically, from what they got last year. Proportionally, that's a little bit harder cut for tenants to homeowners than TBRA proportionally, but I'd be comfortable at that level, I think. Again, I'm with Edith. It's like it's a terrible decision to have to make, but that's what we're tasked with. So. Is there any consensus around that? Is that everybody feel equally bad about?
This is Shannon Reed again. I think that's fair. I mean, that that's a fair application of the circumstances we have before us. The $10,000 off of those total amounts from last year. I guess I'm curious if other folks, especially those with some longer history on this board than myself, I mean, I can see the numbers, but just opinions or thoughts about that, the operating funds line in particular for tenants to homeowners, and the impact of bringing that number down in order to fund the first time home buyer program a little bit stronger. I mean, as has been said, both programs have such value in different ways. And we've had a lot of conversations in my time on this board about the types of programs and projects that have been funding that are linked to services or involve services. These are both examples of that, but to varying degrees. And I mean, with the current real estate market in particular, like the access for first-time home buyers to actual properties, that gap is shrinking and shrinking by the day. It's pretty intense right now. I think we all know that, and there's all these pressures on it. So that program to me is really important to want to maintain as strong as possible, because it's really the one thing that helps people transition and that might eventually kind of even out the scales of how many renters we have in perpetuity that can't gain that wealth, and how many home buyers we have, people that can keep moving up and building that for their families. So that's my stream of consciousness out loud about it. Any feedback about the operating funds line and the impact of that would be helpful for me.
This is Sarah Waters with KU. I wonder if Nicholas Ward could maybe speak to that and what happens if the operating fund line is reduced. Don't know if that's possible. I know he's on the call, and if that would help for context. Shannon?
This is Nicholas Ward. I am on the call. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I think, yeah, I understand the predicament, right? That we're always in these situations, and everything should be funded to the full extent, of course, because the need is expressed and it's present in our community. I think for us, it comes down to how the funds are able to be utilized and what types of flexibilities are inside of those funds based on the restrictions that are within them. So for us, if something's going to be cut by an amount, we would take that cut in first-time homebuyer program. And the reason for that is that our CHOTO operating funds are more flexible. And so if we needed to use a little bit of those operating funds as first-time homebuyer dollars, we can do that, but we can't go the other way around and utilize the first-time homebuyer funds in a flexible way. And so if that makes sense, we're always prioritizing, of course, these market acquisitions or subsidizing the housing that we're building so people can get into them at a lower rate. But that would be, the priority would be then to take some kind of a cut in the first-time home buyer program if that had to happen, and not in operating funds. I hope that's helpful.
This is Shannon Reed again. That's very helpful. Thank you, Nicholas. And thanks, Sarah, for that suggestion. I mean, I'd still like to hear feedback of other board members in response to that, but given that feedback, I mean, I would suggest then is leaving the 22,500 for the operating funds, which would then put it back, 75 for the first time home buyer program, which gets us back to that, what Monty had suggested, kind of shaving 10,000 off of each from what we allocated last year.
Yeah.
Seems as equitable as possible.
Yeah, and historically, I'm looking just at the spreadsheet that Brad provided, and last year we provided almost 85,000 to home buyer. The year before it was 62,000. The year before 72,000. So we're not really back creeping that far for whatever that's worth historically. And I think Ron had his hand up.
I was going to, none of the proposals yet have had voice of a second, and I was going to second this proposal. It's very near what I had originally suggested as a set of numbers. The difference is the $10,000 cut to TBRA from last year's funding. That's not a big cut. I like being able to maintain a steady source of funds for this application. I view that as pretty darn steady. And anyway, I like the way this splits out here right now. I do have one other question though for Nick. Could he give us the same kind of level of explanation for the set aside project funds? Are those flexible also in some ways? How do those dollars get used?
Yep. Thank you, Ron. This is Nicholas Ward with Tenants to Homeowners again. So the project funds themselves are just the way that we function as a CHOTO. We utilize that for the development of sites that we're working at. And so I think right now we have, if I'm reading my notes right, that there's 15 different units we have across, or another 15 sites that we have the ability to develop at. And the thing that's lacking or stopping us from the development is just the availability of funding right now. And so that's, along with other grants that we're pulling and other avenues of funding, that's what allows us to do that initial construction on some of those sites. And so it's really necessary if we're going to be putting new permanently affordable housing units into the hands of folks that need that resource.
Monty still got the chair. Thank you, Nicholas. I am feeling a consensus here. So I'm just procedurally, Shannon, would you make a motion to for this home recommendation? And then I think Ron would be gracious and second it, and then we can take a vote.
Okay, this is Shannon Reed, Douglas County Commission. I move to approve the 2022 home funding recommendations as follows. $240,000 for the transitional housing TBRA program, $67,500 for the CHDO set aside project funds, $22,500 for the CHDO operating funds, and $75,000 for the first time homebuyer program. The total of $405,000 allocated.
Thank you, Shannon. Ron?
Ron Gacious, Chamber Representative. I second that motion.
All right. Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion, further discussion? All right. Seeing none, I will take the roll. Thomas Allen.
Yeah, approve.
Shannon Reed.
Approve.
Sarah Waters.
Approve.
Erica Zimmerman.
Approve.
Dana Ortiz.
Approve.
Ron Gacious.
Approve.
Edith Guffey.
Approved.
Monty Soka. Approved. Motion passes 8-0. Thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful consideration of that. We're going to move on to the the next item, it's capital improvement plan submission in support of housing development. So since the last meeting, as you guys all know, we had a little bit of discussion on the Going South project, which is the Saab construction. And since that, both Leah, I think myself, maybe Ron, a few other people have, maybe Rebecca, I'm not sure. Oh, and thank you for coming back, Shannon and Rebecca. Have had discussions with multiple people, including Frank Saab with Saab Construction and some of the city commissioners. And I think there's still opportunity there. So there's a couple pieces that kind of come up there. One is with the Going South project, the street extension and a capital improvement process that's coming up within the city that approves capital projects for city improvements. So there's a process there that could potentially request funding. Obviously, we don't control any of that, but as we talked about this and the willingness of Saab Construction to continue to talk with us about how this possibly could provide affordable housing has gone forward, I guess we thought it would be good that maybe this board make a recommendation to the city and county staff to continue to work with Saab Construction to determine if there's a way that affordable housing trust funds and or city county CIP funds can be utilized in a way that would provide opportunities for affordable housing. I don't think we're not committing any funds. It's just a recommendation to continue to work with this company and other, ultimately, I think if we had other opportunities like this, that we continue to work this as long as, there is a benefit to affordable housing. And to me, that would look like, lots available to purchase at or below market, or lots gifted, or whatever. I don't know what it looks like yet. But that in combination with potential CIP, if the city found that there was value in spending CIP dollars simply to create lots in the city because of the lack of, availability of lots, period. So I want to open up for discussion on thoughts about that, and if you guys think that a recommendation is appropriate. Go ahead, Dana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dana Ortiz, Family Promise of Lawrence. I want to speak just briefly, setting this kind of conversation up for something Edith kindly reminds us of over and over again, and that is getting the word out about this opportunity and affordable housing and potential funding. Just in the last 2 weeks, I spoke to 3 different developers that didn't know about this. And so it was, so it was an interesting conversation. It was unrelated to affordable housing, but related to Family Promise. And the conversation, of course, with Family Promise is always about housing. It goes in that direction. So I would like us to also think about, when we have our retreat, to how can we get our message out there more clearly about, one, the needs, and these needs assessment studies will help us have credibility with that story, but also how do we get it beyond our current interest levels? Thank you.
Smonty Sokup Chair, that's a good point. I also had a conversation with another developer this week. Actually, a couple weeks ago when the Gerber property was trying to be annexed, I called the engineer for that project and said, I'm probably going to speak against this annexation because I don't think we need a city park. We need affordable housing. But, and he called me back and said, I'm interested in learning how we can get your recommendation for a project. And this week or last week, he actually connected me with a different developer that he's working with we had a really great conversation about what that opportunity might look like. So again, I'm with you. I think we need to get, in my mind, if we could get one project with a private developer under our belt where we got whatever it was, we get a lots available to us or whatever, lots into the Chodo. I think the word will get out pretty quick among developers that there's opportunity there. So.
And I know Tenants to Homeowners has done some of that in the past. One of the developers is somebody that they were proud about speaking with their partnership with Tenants to Homeowners and telling me all about it. And so I think we really do have a model here that we could advertise too with private involvement with nonprofits. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive.
This is Leah Roseland, Affordable Housing Administrator. I wanted to just ask if Rebecca Buford might have an opportunity to talk about the Holcomb property that's also on the list as we're discussing the CIP. And Ms. Ortiz, not to not to disregard your comment, I wrote that down as a note for the retreat, but in the interest of time, I'm wondering if we could focus on the CIP submission and if the board wishes to make a move to submit a project on behalf of the AHAB.
This is Rebecca with Tenants to Homeowners. Leah asked, we are looking at, we as in the community, really, all these partners, a possible project would be that Holcomb land that I think Diane had on that list that she presented to us of kind of potential land out there. That wasn't city owned, but the city was talking to the school district, or so it's school district owned, and we all know the school district could use some resources right now. So it may be very timely, and requesting CIP dollars to be able to buy that. I think they've gotten it is, gosh, and I'm going to forget the acreage, but Monty, D or Leah, do you guys, does anyone remember the acreage on that?
It's almost 9.
Yeah.
Almost 9.
Almost 9 acres. So a very significant plot of, very good land, very good location right by Holcomb Park and the recreation center, the baseball diamonds there. It's nice because it's got single family, it's got rental, it's kind of in a nice neighborhood of mixed types of housing and mixed incomes, but it also is, of course, has amenities with for families, and it is west, relatively more west than west of Iowa. So, Monty and has been talking about, we just need a signature project that we can point to the trust funds having created really a development of affordable housing, a spectrum of affordable, where we could, just as was spoken to earlier, a percentage of supportive service housing, a percentage of affordable rental housing, a percentage of home ownership, first-time home buyer housing, that all of us partners could be involved in. And so I think that's a real opportunity. I know the school district said, if you guys could give us $1 million, we'd take it in a minute. And I think that was, at that point, it was kind of like, we'd take less too. Again, I called them a couple days ago and asked, and he said, well, we had an appraisal done and it was at $1 million. So, he wasn't offering less at that point, but they never do. So I do think we, could ask for a certain amount, $850,000 from CIP to buy those 9 acres and really make a project. And, assume that almost everyone could be involved in different pieces of that affordable housing units. So I think that's a potential ask too, that we need to be, asking CIP in this moment for that. And I think then home ARPA funds and other kinds of funding without, publicly saying we're going to use that, but there's a bunch of different types of funding that we could use for different types of housing in a project like that. Leah, did that cover what you wanted me to?
Yeah. Okay, hold on. Shannon, and then I'll get to you, Edith. We got a couple.
Okay. Okay, so I just want to make sure where we're headed. So this would be a recommendation that the purchase of that property be included in the CIP. And then at that point, the city owns it, and the possibility would be through an RFP or something, various people who want to develop affordable housing could submit applications to the city for that project. Is that where we're headed?
Monty Sokup, Chair. I'm not sure exactly where we're headed yet. I was thinking that it would go into the Chodo somehow, whether the city bought it and placed it there, which I believe they can do, or whether the Chodo actually bought it. The funds came through the Chodo and that was purchased that way. I'm not sure legally how that all occurs. What I know is we probably need to try to get that piece of ground, or what I think we should do is try to get that piece of ground under our control. Obviously, we need to figure out the logistics of how that all works.
This is Leah Roseland, Affordable Housing Administrator. Just to clarify, with the CIP, that request is for projects that need repairs or improvements to infrastructure. And so the CIP request for the Holcomb property would be for the infrastructure. And according to the memo that Assistant City Manager Diane Stoddard presented to the AHAB in 2021, the infrastructure costs for that site are between $350,000 and $400,000 to bring utilities to the site, including connecting a water line and establishing stormwater and sewer connections. So that would be the specific CIP request, and then we would also need to have discussion on purchasing the property and the ownership of that property.
So we may need to use trust fund dollars to purchase the property is one thing, or it could be ARPA funds or some other funding source that's available, as I understand it.
This is Shannon Reed, Douglas County Commission. Thanks, Leah, for that. I'm wondering, do we know, and I'm sorry if I missed it in earlier conversation, any conversations with the school district yet about what even a ballpark of purchase price for that size of that piece of land would be? Do we have a sense of that and I missed it? The number maybe? Sorry if you said it, Rebecca, and I missed it.
It's Monty's Sokup, Chair. I think Rebecca was between $1,800,000 and $1 million.
Okay, thank you.
Somewhere in there. It's kind of the ballpark idea.
But Shannon, this is Rebecca with Tenants Homeowners. We didn't really make an offer, so and they kind of said, make us an offer. So I feel like there is some way. No one said we need this amount.
That helps. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Monty Sokup, Chair. Also, as a state entity, they're going to have some restrictions on what they can do. We all get that, right? So I guess here, are there any other comments? Anybody got something on their mind they want to share? Okay, go ahead, Edith.
I just know that we have talked for a while about being more aggressive and not just sitting around and waiting for projects to come to us, which is what we've done for the last, I don't know how many years. And this is a time for us to, how many more years are we going to sit around and talk about the need for affordable housing and not do something different that might, the example of idiocy is just sitting around and doing the same thing over and over and over again. This is an opportunity to do something different, more aggressive, that might make a difference in how we operate. And I hope we'll take the opportunity.
You're here. Ron, go ahead.
In keeping with Edith's enthusiasm for being proactive, I'd like to make a motion My motion is that the city set aside $500,000 in the capital improvement plan funds to be used exclusively in support of an affordable housing project to be presented to the city by AHAB no later than December 1 of this year. And that gives us an opportunity to pursue the Holcomb project, perhaps to have further conversations with Mr. Saab, or also reach out to other developers and home builders that might have expressed an interest recently and can come together in the next couple of months and bring us some good examples of how this CIP dollars could be used. I have a lot of heart for this. I think there's a real opportunity here. I think at least a couple of the city commissioners have sent signals to us that, you know, the door's open a crack and we'd really like to see you guys, you know, show us how we can be supportive of affordable housing. And, you know, we kind of got caught up short this year by coming in towards the end of the cycle. I think the city commission is getting ready to make decisions on these recommendations very shortly. So we don't have the pleasure of waiting till next month's meeting to make a recommendation. So I think I said, what, $500,000 to be set aside in the CIP budget for affordable housing recommendations to come from AHAB no later than December 1st.
All right.
Shannon Lowry, Housing Authority, I second that motion.
All right. So we have a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any further discussion on that?
This is Leah Roseland, Affordable Housing Administrator. Just to clarify, so the CIP application is due March 22nd. And so if I could get clarity on the original motion, it sounds like to me like the motion is not to submit a CIP application on behalf of the AHAB, but to what would the alternative process be with that December 1st deadline if we're not submitting a CIP application?
Well, but my motion is that they put a line item in the CIP of $500,000 for an AHAB project or projects to be determined, to be recommended to them no later than December 1st.
So the way I understand that, Ron, you correct me if I mistake, we do want to put an application for $500,000 for a project to be defined by December 1st.
Yes, yes.
Which is probably abnormal.
Absolutely, in every way. Yeah. Let's go get our toes wet and see if something works.
All right, any other discussion, clarification? Everybody understand that? All right, I am going to take the roll then. Thomas Allen.
I approve.
Shannon Reed.
Yes.
Rebecca Buford.
Approve.
Sarah Waters.
Approve.
Erica Zimmerman.
Approve.
Dana Ortiz.
Yes.
Shannon Oury.
Approve.
Ron Gacious.
Approve.
Edith Guffey.
Approve.
Monty Soka. Approved. Motion passes 10-0. All right. Thank you, everybody, for that. We got a couple minutes here. The next item is to consider formalizing a cycle for a process for out of cycle requests. I'm not sure we're going to have enough time to cover this today because I think this takes a little more conversation than 5 minutes or so. I'm going to suggest that we table this till next month. Everybody okay with that? Do we need to take a vote to table something? Okay, excellent. Then we'll move on to, thank you, for staff updates. So Leah, I'm going to turn it over to you for the staff updates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Leah Roseland, Affordable Housing Administrator. I wanted to make a quick note that the quick update section is now labeled staff updates to reflect the content being shared. And moving forward, I'll use this opportunity to keep the AHAB updated on affordable housing related projects and updates. Please note that I have not included summaries of committee meetings or community engagement updates at this time, but I'm happy to include that content in the future if the AHAB would like to receive those updates. The first item is the monthly financial report. We collected a little over $91,000 in Affordable Housing Trust Fund sales tax in February. No change on the expense side, and we anticipate meeting budgeted revenue. The second item, staff is looking at developing an Affordable Housing Pathways program to provide incentives and additional guidance for developing affordable housing. We will keep the AHAB updated as we make progress, and we'll invite feedback and AHAB participation as we move through the process. Please send me any ideas or feedback you have that may be beneficial for that project. Item number 3, all Affordable Housing Trust Fund agreements have been fully executed. All fund recipients have received their signed agreements and reporting guidelines. Reports will be made quarterly and will be shared with the AHAB to monitor progress. Item number 4, the Tenants to Homeowners Harper 7 project was approved by the City Commission at their March 1st meeting, and the agreement is forthcoming after legal review and approval. And then the final item is staff met with legal to discuss creating a revolving loan program for affordable housing development using trust fund dollars for the startup. In the upcoming months, I will be looking at peer city affordable housing loan programs and starting to develop processes and procedures for that. So please send me any ideas or feedback that you have that may be beneficial for this project. I also wanted to make a quick note that there is going to be an affordable housing forum at the Lawrence Public Library on Monday, April 4th at 5:30 that the Lawrence Public Library is hosting, if anybody would like to participate in that. And then just to circle back on the Burt Nash Supportive Housing Project, if any AHAB members would like Burt Nash to present at the April meeting, I'm happy to invite them. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Sarah Waters. I have a quick question for Leah. Is there an update on the Home Builders Association rep to this group? Because I think that person might have been pretty critical to some of the conversations today. So just wondering if there's a status update.
This is Leah Roseland, Affordable Housing Administrator. The Home Builders Association did nominate a representative, and that has gone to the mayor for review and approval, but that approval and nomination has not been made yet. I spoke with Mayor Shipley last month, and she stated that she believes that a nomination will be made shortly, but it has not been approved yet.
It's Shannon Reed, Douglas County Commissioner. Thanks for that question, Sarah. I had the same one and would really like somebody hopefully in that seat by the time we have our retreat, because it is such a critical piece of the conversation that has been notably missing, I think. And then I also just wanted to say that I was sad to miss last month's meeting, but very excited to see the Harper 7 project, as we're calling it, move forward. I had went to that open house just because that plot of land was always so odd to me over there, and immediately was like, this needs a density bonus. You can build a lot of houses here. So thank you, Rebecca, for seeing that vision and bringing that. And I'm glad that everybody here pushed that forward. That was a good example of opportunity was in front of us. There are tools to make it happen, and we made it happen. So grateful for that.
Thanks.
And about, Leah, you asked about Burt Nash folks coming. I think that could be useful, although I'm wondering how heavy our April agenda may be already. Maybe you don't know that, but just considering that we're pushing the conversation from today until then, and just wanting to make sure we are mindful of how crowded our agenda might get.
Thank you, everybody. That is the end of the updates, correct, Leah? Okay, any other new business? Oh, Rebecca?
Monty, sorry. This is Rebecca with Tenants to Homeowners. Lee, I'm wondering, and I agree with Shannon, our April meeting might be too full, but I do think actually maybe Bert Nash and Dana to talk about what Family Promise does. Eric and I could just mention what kind of support services are with ownership programs. And I mean, I was a little, I know it's just so hard to know about everybody's silo, but it does feel like this group should really know what a day is like for the agencies that are doing most of this work. And what does that really look like? You know, Ron had a great question, and some of that is you just have to hear an example of what that stuff is. You know, when we talk about support services, it's generic and not well defined. You know, and of course it depends on the people we're working with, but there's a good list of the kinds of things we consistently have to deal with or do to keep people successful in housing. And these are folks that are not, you know, I mean, have some skill sets that are missing or have challenges with those. And so you do, if you haven't worked in those fields before, you don't think about those things, because a lot of us are lucky enough to not have struggled with those barriers. But so I think presenting some of that would be really helpful for this board at some point, even if it's 10 or 15 minutes of examples.
Thank you, Rebecca. We'll get April for that. Any other new business? Okay, I'm gonna let you read the calendar. I'm not gonna read that to you. And then I would accept a motion to adjourn if there's no other comments.
Move to adjourn. Ron Gaseous, Chamber Representative, move to adjourn.
Shannon Reed, second.
Okay. Read the rule real quick. Thomas Allen.
Yes.
Shannon Reed.
Yes.
Rebecca Buford.
Yes.
Sarah Waters.
Yes.
Erica Zimmerman.
Yes.
Okay. Dana Ortiz.
Yes.
Shannon Ellery.
Yes.
Ron Gaseous.
Yes.
Edith Guffey.
Yes.
Monty Sokop, yes. Motion passes 10-0. Thank you for your time and thoughtfulness today, and we'll see you in a month if I don't talk to you before.